welcome everyone. My name is Misty Mercich. I'm the Sustainability Manager for the City of Cupertino. We have some great speakers lined up for you tonight on the topic of electrification as the solution to climate change. This is kind of a timely topic, as many of you might be aware. A few weeks ago, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released a report concluding that globally we only have a dozen years for global warming to be kept at around 1.5 degrees Celsius, which if we increase even a half a degree significantly, we'll see worsening risks of drought, floods, extreme heat, poverty for hundreds of millions of people. It was a very sobering report. But today I hope you come away with some hope and hope for the future and learn some things that are happening globally as well as locally to fight climate change and hopefully keep those degrees below that. So with that, I'd like to introduce Gary Latshaw, Sustainability Speaker, who will introduce our first speaker. But before he comes up, I should say we have two speakers tonight. Each of them will speak and then they'll be answering questions right afterwards. So we encourage you to use the microphones. We walk around with microphones when it's question and answer period because this is going to be recorded. So with that, I'll turn it over to Gary. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Gary Latshaw. I'm on the Sustainability Commission. Angela Chen is also, the two of us form the group that tries to put together presentations of interest to our audience, and she couldn't make it tonight. So it's my pleasure to introduce, actually in the last few months, Professor Mark Jacobsen from Stanford. He spoke at our local Rotary several months ago. Mark's done a wide range of things and accomplishments, and I could probably take an hour to explain them all. But one of the things when I went through your record was in 1988, he got 3 degrees from Stanford in economics, bachelor's, engineering, bachelor's, and then a master's degree in engineering. He has authored 150 plus papers, 2 textbooks, all on energy and the environment. He early on in his career in his doctoral thesis examined the interaction of air pollution and climate pollutants, and it was those analyses were critical in formulating our plans against black carbon distribution. He's been a variety of places, from testifying to Congress to being on the David Letterman show and doing TED Talks. So with that, I'll turn it over to him.
Thank you, Gary, and thank you, Misty, for those kind introductions. So I'm going to talk today about plans that we've been developing actually for the last 10 years. It'll be almost 10 years that we developed our first clean renewable energy plan for the world, which was published in Scientific American in 2009. And really these plans involved electrifying everything and providing that electricity with clean renewable energy. And that's not only for transportation, but also home heating and industrial heat. And all the electricity will be provided with clean renewable energy. And I'm pleased to say that one of our plans, which was published in 2014, which was a roadmap for powering California for all purposes with wind, water, and solar, served as the scientific basis for SB 100, which was the law that was recently passed by California's governor, by the California Assembly, and signed by the governor. And we developed plans not only for California, but also for New York, and then Washington State, and in all 50 states in the US, and we've done 139 countries of the world and 53 towns and cities. We don't have Cupertino on it, sorry. not yet, just getting there. We do have a lot of towns and cities in California, as well as around the US. And so anyway, I'll talk about the impacts of some of these plans later, but I want to really talk about not only the policy level, what these plans entail and what policymakers can do, but what individuals can do in their own homes and businesses to transition. Well, first of all, why do we care and why do I care? I mean, I started this because I was always interested in trying to understand and solve large-scale air pollution and climate problems. And I mean, worldwide today, there are 4 to 7 million people die from air pollution each year, from cardiovascular disease, respiratory illness, complications from asthma. And in terms of statistical cost of life and morbidity, it's around $20 to $25 trillion per year today. And then the air pollution is actually getting worse in most of the world, although the United States is actually not so bad as other places. Global warming is a growing problem and already causing significant damage, but it's expected to cause around $25 to $30 trillion per year worldwide in damage by 2050. And the other issue is energy security. Fossil fuels are limited resources. They cause conflict. Their scarcity will ultimately result in social, economic, and political instability. So we need to change them at some point. We might as well change them now to avoid these problems in the future. So these are 3 critical problems that we're trying to address. And so I want to just talk about details of how we hope to do this with everybody's help. So again, the idea is to electrify everything. So for transportation, for example, we go to battery electric vehicles and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles or hybrids between the two. And the hydrogen would be used mostly for long distance ships, trains, trucks, and planes. And I'll even show you some military equipment as well. And then heating and cooling, mostly with heat pumps, which use 1/4 the energy as electric resistance heaters even, or gas heaters. So these run on electricity, but they're much more efficient because they don't create heat, they move heat. And some solar hot water preheating, but heat pumps running on electricity is primary mechanism. And then for industry, arc furnaces, induction furnaces, dielectric heaters, these are technologies that are already existing. And I'll show you some examples in a second. But then the electricity is all going to be derived from onshore and offshore wind, solar photovoltaics on rooftops and in power plants, concentrated solar power, some existing hydroelectric power, tidal power, geothermal, and some wave. And we'll also need storage, which I'll talk about. But so just to give you some examples of these existing electric technologies, not only technologies that we'd replace, well, for industry, but also show you just some appliances as well. So this is on the right is an induction furnace, electric induction furnace. On the left is an electric arc furnace. So these are existing technologies for producing high temperatures for industrial processes. And then there are long-distance trucks are already starting to become commercial. The Tesla semi-electric, and Nikola One also has a semi. Proterra has an electric bus. There are hydrogen fuel cell electric hybrid buses already in existence. I think there was a number that China was producing like 60,000 buses, I don't know if it was like a month or something like that, to replace their diesel buses. But this is needed. You need a large-scale transition for everything. I have a student who's in the Army. He's working on looking at transitioning all Army vehicles, including tanks and helicopters and marine vessels. And so this shows an example of some calculations for different types of tanks and vehicles. If you switch them all to battery electrics with 2020 target technology, what this shows is that the mass would be slightly larger, up to like 15-20% larger at the most. But some of these vehicles, you can see they're pretty much the same mass, but they're all equal or lesser volume, in fact. And which is important because certain of these vehicles have to fit through certain tunnels on bridges that are a certain size, so you can't have them bigger. But you can see that's feasible. But then if you even go to hydrogen fuel cell, these are the same things with hydrogen fuel cell. They weigh less, and in most cases their volumes are less as well. Anyway, so you can actually go through every single vehicle, including we've done 747s as well, and big ships and trains, and you can do something. You can do electric or hydrogen fuel cell to change all of these. For airplanes, probably be the last thing to transition, but there are already companies building electric aircraft to go 1,500 kilometers. The one on the left is just a couple-seater, but it can go 1,500 kilometers already. But these companies are trying to build commercial aircrafts that seat 50 to 100 people that would go up to 1,500 kilometers, pure electric. On the bottom right is a hydrogen fuel cell aircraft that exists that already goes 1,500 kilometers and seats 4 people. And on the top right is a drawing of a cryogenic hydrogen aircraft that would, so it would be larger volume in this case, but it weighs less. Anyway, these are all technologies that are either existing or we're capable of doing. I mean, all rockets have been propelled into space with hydrogen, almost all rockets, so that's, it's an existing technology. There's a startup that's building this to replace some helicopters. It's a vertical takeoff and landing vehicle. And again, this is all electric. So, and then what about just normal everyday things like leaf blowers? I mean, the worst thing in the world is like a leaf blower because it smells and it's noisy, right? So an electric leaf blower neither smells nor is noisy. But these are existing technologies that can replace current gasoline or diesel appliances. Same thing with lawnmowers, electric lifts instead of fossil fuel lifts. And there are technologies that have really started to boom of late. Offshore wind that is floating, so floating offshore wind. There are now several farms that have been installed worldwide, and this is really important because it allows the development of offshore wind, for example, off California's coast, because California has a very deep water, has very deep top bathymetry, whereas the East Coast has pretty shallow bathymetry. So it's very difficult. There are only a few places where you can put offshore wind off California and actually have it sunk into the ocean floor. So floating offshore really allows you to put the turbines further out so nobody complains about them because you can't see them. And there's a huge amount of resource. The offshore of the east and west coast, pretty much the largest untapped wind resources in the world. And they could really power the entire United States on their own, just those resources. Floating solar is really useful for island countries and also or countries that have high population near the coast, like Singapore, and that are small, like Singapore and Gibraltar, for example. They could take advantage of offshore floating solar. Well, we also need storage for such a transition. And we need electricity storage, heat and cold storage, and there's also hydrogen, which is a form of storage in itself. So for electricity, we'd use combination of concentrated solar power with storage. The way concentrated solar power works is you have light focusing off of mirrors onto a central tower to heat a fluid. That fluid can then be stored in a tank overnight. And then when you need electricity, you run the fluid by water to boil the water and evaporate it. And the steam from the water runs a steam turbine to generate electricity. So you can generate electricity 24 hours a day with concentrated solar power with storage. And it's actually a very cheap form of storage. While batteries are $200 to $300 per kilowatt hour, concentrated solar power, the storage component is only about $25 to $30 per kilowatt hour. So it's like 1/10. But photovoltaics right now are cheaper than the actual concentrated solar power units per kilowatt hour. So it's a balance between battery storage with photovoltaics and concentrated solar power with thermal energy storage. Right now, the batteries and photovoltaics are winning slightly, but CSP with storage also works well in some places. Pumped hydroelectric power, where you have two reservoirs, an upper and lower one, and when you have excess electricity, you pump water up the hill, and when you need that electricity, you let the water drain down the hill to run a turbine. So the city of Los Angeles, maybe the county of Los Angeles, is actually spending like, I think it was $3 or $4 billion to turn Hoover Dam into one large pumped hydro power facility, because they have the lake behind the reservoir, Lake Mead, and then downstream about 20 miles there's another lake. So when water drains down, they'll just have pipes that are buried underground to pump the water back up to Lake Mead and basically recirculate it. And so that allows you to generate electricity when you need it, which is important when you have lots of wind and solar, which are intermittent, which means that the sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow. But pumped hydros are, it's pretty commonplace right now in the US, and it's relatively inexpensive. It's not going to grow a huge amount, but it is useful for some purposes. And then batteries, of course, don't take up a lot of space, and they're coming down in cost quite a bit. They're not only lithium ion, but there's also other types like zinc air batteries, which are starting to gain a foothold. And then heating, cooling, we'd store heat and cold in water, and store heat in rocks and cold in ice, and I'll show examples in a second. And we'd use hydrogen for transportation, and that's a form of storage for excess wind and solar. We can use it to produce hydrogen. And then demand response is a technique by which utilities will charge people different amounts at different times of the day to encourage them or discourage them to use electricity at that time of the day. So price is higher usually in the afternoon because that's when everybody wants to use electricity. So if you raise the price of electricity, then it'll shift the time of peak demand to a different time, theoretically. So let me just show you some examples. This is ice cooling. So Stanford used to have a big ice cube under a building that when the electricity price was low at night, the electricity was used to produce ice. And then during the day, instead of using electricity for air conditioning, water went through the coils in the ice and was then sent to the buildings to cool the buildings. And so this is a form of electricity storage, except that there's no electricity involved. And it costs about $38 a kilowatt hour versus, now it's $200 for batteries per kilowatt hour, but it used to be, this was first built for Stanford. They built their system in 1998. At that time, batteries were just way more expensive. Any case, so cold storage, it's pretty common for hospitals and stadiums and other types of big facilities. So it's not a new technology, but people just haven't used it on the large scale that we need it. Then there's underground thermal energy storage. One type is in rocks. This is a community in Okotoks, Canada, 1 hour south of Calgary. There are 52 homes that were built in 2004 and 5. On the roofs of these homes were, on the roofs of the garages, these solar collectors were installed where there's a glycol solution in the collectors. During the summer, where you have long days, the glycol solution collects heat from the sun. The solution is then piped to this building on the right where the heat is transferred to water in pipes. The water is then piped under this field, this grassy field, which was excavated and filled with rocks and some pipes, and then filled in. And the hot water heats the rocks up to 80 degrees Celsius. That heat is stored for up to 6 months. And the whole system is run in reverse during the year, but over a 6-month period. And that provides 100% of the heat for these 52 homes in the winter, such as in the bottom left when the snow is on the ground. So this type of storage costs less than $1 per kilowatt hour for storage. Even some estimates are like 30 cents a kilowatt hour for the storage portion. And compared heat storage, it's not electricity storage, but compared to batteries, it's about $200 or $300 a kilowatt hour. But this is a form of district heating, and you can do the same kind of district heating with water. Like you can have a big pit of water, for example, and heat that and store that heat. Or there are other types of storage media. But like Denmark, 60% of their heating is called district heating, but it's not for 6 months, it's not long term, but they do have water tanks in the city. And then instead of everybody having their individual heater, the centralized water system pipes the hot water to buildings, and that's used for heating the water and for heating the buildings themselves. So district heating is pretty common. It's more efficient when you have pretty dense urban infrastructure, but it's also useful in the suburbs as well. Another type of, another example of heat storage and cold storage. So Stanford used to, till 2015, there was a natural gas cogeneration plant that provided 80% of the campus heating and electricity. This gas plant was bulldozed and replaced with these 2 boilers and a chiller and 50 megawatts of solar, maybe 60 megawatts of solar. And the way this works is basically, well, on the right is 1 year of cold and heat demand. So on the left side of the graph is January, and the right side is December. So you can see in the winter, you have higher heat demand, which is the bright red. And the bright blue is the cold demand, which peaks in the summer. But every time you produce cold, you release waste heat. And when you produce heat, you release waste cold. So instead of wasting that extra heat and extra cold, it's now captured and piped to these 2 boilers and a chiller and stored, and then shipped around the university to where it's needed. So that saved a lot of energy just by trapping waste heat and waste cold and shipping it around. And then Stanford bought solar in the Mojave Desert and used that for the electricity needed for most of the campus. So that got them 68% carbon free, well, 68% of their electricity from renewable sources, essentially. But now they've just committed and just bought 72 megawatts more of solar to go to 100% renewable electricity for the campus once that's installed by 2021. And they also committed to 100% clean transportation. So also, well, I think that's by 2025, but hopefully sooner. And then there's some other sources that would, they're trying to get rid of all the greenhouse gas emissions, so they do intend to go to 0 carbon emissions as well. But they're going to be 100% clean renewable electricity and transportation. Well, by 2021 for electricity and 2025 by transportation, if not sooner. So let me go down, drill down to a finer level, to a household level. So I built a home on the campus that I moved into about a year and a half ago, and I made sure there was no gas coming on the property. It was all electric. So I just wanted to show you what I did. And I have over a year of data. Well, I'll show you 1 year of data from that. But basically, so everything's electric. And so I use heat pumps for air heating and cooling, and and for water heating as well. So this particular heat pump is called a ductless mini split heat pump, air heater and air conditioner. And again, it doesn't create heat or cold, it moves heat. So it takes heat from outside, sucks heat from the outside and moves it in when you need the heat, or it sucks cold from the outside and move it in. So the unit on the right is the outside unit, and then in each zone of the house you have a unit like on the left. And instead of ducts, that's why it's called ductless, there are no ducts to send heat around the house. There are copper pipes with coolant, and that really then transfers heat either in or out of the house. So basically, if the house is hot and you want to cool it down, the hot air is blown over the coolant, which absorbs the heat and then sends it out of the house. So it basically moves heat around, it doesn't create it. So it uses 1/4 the energy as your typical gas heater, which is good. And the same thing with this heat pump water heater. This is in a mechanical room, so it actually takes the heat out of the room itself and moves it to the water in the tank. And that fan on the top kind of blows cold. So the room becomes slightly more cold, but just a couple degrees. In fact, in the summer, that's good because you can then open the door and then it'll help air condition the house. But it works really well. Again, it uses 1/4 the energy as your typical water heater. And it hasn't had any problem. It costs pretty similar to a conventional water heater. For a stove, instead of a gas stove, I use an electric induction cooktop stove. This costs the same again as a gas stove, but it boils water in half the time. It controls the heat just the same or better than a gas stove. And then if you touch the stove, it doesn't feel hot, even when you're boiling water. That's because it's not actually producing heat to actually to make the pot hot. It's creating vibrations that cause vibrations in the pot itself. So you need certain types of pot, either an iron or stainless steel bottom for the pot. Iron and I think it was stainless steel, might have been aluminum. But anyway, it causes vibrations that then make the pot hot, but keep the stove cold, except for some heat that gets conducted from the pot back to the stove. Anyway, it works really well. Then for generating power, I have solar on the roof, and batteries in the garage. There are 4 batteries, but PG&E only let me turn on 2. And so the house is, I'm only using 2 batteries, but actually it turns out that's fine because if I were using more, then I'd probably actually not save as much money as because it'd be, well, there's a technical reason for that, because I'd be using the power, I'd be using power when it's more expensive. Anyway, maybe I'll explain it a little later, it's a little complicated. But two batteries is sufficient in this case to, as I'll show you, the electricity bill was not only 0, I got a check at the end of the year. And they're in their electric cars as well. In fact, so the solar system was designed to have electric cars, but it turned out everything was so efficient that I was generating much more electricity over the year, even after charging not only 2 cars, but my son has an electric car, and he'd bring it over to charge as well. And so there are 3 cars that were being charged. So here's one week of electricity use, just to give you an example of how this works. So so they're batteries, they're solar, and the green is the solar production during the day, and this is a summer week. And the light blue is home consumption, including battery consumption. So in the morning, electricity is first used from the PV panels is first used to power things in the home. And when those loads are satisfied, then the power goes to fill the battery, which is drained at night. So the battery starts to get drained, and you can see on the bottom is the battery level. So the bottom level is 50% because there are 2 batteries that are not being used. And so that's the lowest. But in the morning, you can see the battery starts to get charged and gets filled up pretty quickly. And then the battery sits there all day until the sun goes down. When the sun goes down, the battery turns on and is used to power the home. And so the dark blue is basically nighttime battery consumption in the home. And then the red is grid electricity. And really the only times I'm using grid electricity are when I'm charging the cars, because the discharge rate of the battery, well, each battery is 3.3 kilowatts. So together that's 6.6 kilowatts, that's as fast as it can discharge. But you can see that Tesla Model S requires 20 kilowatts, at least it's, and so you would need basically 5 batteries, or no, sorry, more than that, 6, 7 batteries for the Tesla Model S. And then the other one, the Roadster, requires, it's 10 kilowatts, so you can see the battery's trying to charge the Roadster, but it does for a little bit, but then it runs out of steam because it empties out. And so you need grid electricity. However, even during this week where I'm charging 2 cars, still I'm sending 50% of all the electricity generated back to the grid. And if I go to the annual average, so this is 1 year of electricity use. It generated 120% of all home and vehicle energy use. So no electric bill, no gas bill, no gasoline bill, and then received a $530 check from Silicon Valley Clean Energy. So I was very pleased about that. But the other thing was that there was an avoided cost. Not only each year there's an avoided cost, but the startup cost, because I didn't have to have my gas lines hooked up to the property, and PG&E charges between like $3,000 and $8,000 just to hook it up from the edge of the property to your property. And I ask them why they do that, and they say, well, everybody in PG&E has to take a cut. There's no reason except for having somebody come out there and hook them up. But they charge you a huge amount, but that gets saved. And also the gas pipes, and these are average numbers, so I'm probably somewhere in the middle there, of $1,000 to $7,000 per household if you avoid gas pipes in your home. And then, typical electric bills, $1,000 to $3,000, typical gas bills, $1,000 to $3,000, and vehicle bills, $1,000 to $4,000. So a typical person, if they did this, would save $4,000 to $15,000 up front, plus $3,000 to $10,000 per year. So the payback time for this system with subsidies, because there are right now still good subsidies, federal tax credits, and state subsidies as well, it's about 5 to 6 years for the whole system. But everything's, well, the solar is warranted for 25 years. Batteries are warranted for 10, but since since I have 4 and they're only used half time, I guess that's 20 years. But if there were no subsidies, there'd be about a 10-year payback time, which is still pretty good. But I mean, I'm doing it because I want to do it. It's still nice to feel that it's also economic as well to do this. And it just works wonderfully. I mean, the temperature in the house is just the same all year, no matter how cold it is or hot it is outside. It's just perfect temperature all year, the system, and it just hardly uses, as you can see from that. I mean, if I go back to this plot, I mean, these are summer days, and look how little energy is being used in the home for air conditioning. And this is to keep the house at a perfect temperature. And it's hardly using any energy because the heat pumps are just so efficient. Okay, so then question is next, can we actually power the entire world with clean renewable energy? And as I mentioned, we developed plans for 139 countries of the world, which represent more than 99% of all emissions worldwide. And I'm going to show you the aggregate impact of all these plans. So the 2012 power demand for all 139 countries is about 12.1 trillion watts or terawatts. And that's expected to go up to 20.6 terawatts in 2050. But if we electrify everything and provide that electricity with clean renewable energy, well, without heat pumps, we'd go down to 11.8 terawatts. And with heat pumps, we'd go down to 8.6 terawatts, or 58% reduction of demand. And you can see the breakdown of why we get this improvement. And this is really without you really changing your habits at all. Well, 23 percentage points is due to the efficiency of electricity over combustion averaged over all sectors. You get the best benefit in transportation because batteries, 80 to 86% of the electricity going into a car goes to move the car, and the rest is waste heat. Whereas with a gasoline car, only 17 to 20% of the energy in the gasoline goes to move the car, and the rest is waste heat. So with a car, you reduce your end-use power demand by a factor of 4 to 5 just by electrifying your car. But averaged over all sectors, that's about 23% reduction of demand. Then 13% of all energy worldwide is used to mine, transport, and refine fossil fuels. So we can eliminate that energy by going to clean renewable energy. And then heat pumps are about, you can reduce, if you use heat pumps for all heating and cooling, including refrigeration and water and air heating, you can reduce demand another 16%. And then 7% reduction due to end-use energy efficiency improvements beyond what's expected as business as usual. So that's 58% reduction. So you can imagine, even if the cost of energy per kilowatt hour were the same in a clean renewable energy system, you're using half the kilowatt hours. So you're saving half the cost less right away, costs half as much. Even if the cost per kilowatt hour is the same, the cost that you're paying out of your wallet is half as much, because you're using less energy. And you can see that in that chart I showed you for my home. You're using less energy with heat pumps, for example, than you would with gas heaters, for example. So this didn't come out well, but this shows the one way that we could provide, and actually this is for this case of 11.8 terawatts without even heat pumps. This shows how can we provide that 11.8 terawatts of power in 2050 just with wind and water and solar power. So this is with 23.5% onshore wind, 14% offshore wind, 16% residential rooftop photovoltaics, 12% commercial government rooftop photovoltaics, 20% PV power plants, 10% CSP power plants, 1% geothermal, 4% hydro, which all exists. The numbers on the right are the number of new devices you'd need, and so we have 0 new hydro plants, and then less than 1% tidal wave power. So in terms of wind, it's about 1.7 million onshore and offshore wind turbines, 2.7 million onshore and offshore wind turbines. That might sound like a lot, but I'll show you the land areas in a second. And you can see all the photovoltaics you would need. And we actually checked rooftop areas. There are enough rooftop areas to meet all these, plenty of rooftop. In fact, we had all sorts of exclusions for shading and north-facing roofs and roofs that were weak, things like that. But this is the land area required worldwide for these plans to be implemented. Well, So for offshore, obviously we don't need any new land. So offshore wind, tidal, wave power. And then on land, rooftop PV does not take up new land. There's no new hydro. Geothermal is trivial. So it's all utility scale photovoltaics and CSP and onshore wind. And the PV plus CSP takes up 0.22% of the world's land area, so that's 1/5 of 1%. And then the spacing between the wind turbines is 0.92%. The footprint on the ground of the wind turbines is pretty trivial. But it's just there's space between the turbines in farms, but that space can be used for agriculture, open space, or you can even put the solar panels in between the turbines. So that's dual purpose land. But just take that number, 1.14%. Well, I bet you could never guess how much land is used by the fossil fuel industry that this would replace. So here are some numbers. Here's for California and the United States. In the United States, there are 1.2 million active oil and gas wells and 2.6 million inactive ones, or abandoned ones. There are 550,000 abandoned gas wells, 1,500 coal mines, 135 oil refineries, 1.6 million miles of gas pipes, 161,000 miles of oil pipes, 3,300 power plants, 115,000 gas stations, 394 gas storage facilities. They take up 1.3% of the United States land area, about 1.7% of California's land area, just for the oil and gas infrastructure. And every year, the US produces 50,000 new oil and gas wells just to sustain itself. 50,000 new ones are drilled. So this is what we're replacing. We can eliminate this entire energy infrastructure if we go to clean renewable energy. We'll use less land area worldwide. So now the next question is, can you keep the grid stable with just clean renewable energy? So we did scenarios, 3 different scenarios where we broke up all the 139 countries into 20 world regions, and then did a grid stability analysis by modeling with a climate model that was able to predict the winds every 30 seconds for 5 years in the solar fields. And we tried to then match the power demand in each of these 20 world regions with renewable wind and solar and geothermal and hydroelectric, and then storage as well. And there were 3 scenarios we ran. This just summarizes them, although it's not easy to read that. But basically we had, in one case, for example, we had batteries, concentrated solar power with storage, heat and cold storage, no heat pumps at all, no added hydropower turbines to existing dams. We had hydropower storage and hydrogen for transportation. And then in another scenario, we had no batteries, but added hydropower turbines. And then in the third scenario, we had batteries, no added hydropower turbines, but we had heat pumps. We used heat pumps instead. So they're kind of 3 extreme scenarios. And in the third scenario, there's no heat or cold storage at all. But in all cases, we were able to keep the grid stable in all regions. And you can see the cost of energy in all 3 cases was pretty similar. But in the third case with the heat pumps, we actually reduced the power demand the most. So you're going to get, it's actually going to cost less per person because you're using fewer kilowatt hours in the third scenario. But let me just show you really briefly. I'll run through all 20 world regions for 1 month, showing matching power demand with supply continuously without any grid failure. So no blackouts in any world region with just wind, water, and solar. And I want to point this out. I can't emphasize too much that this is the #1 issue that utilities fear is grid stability. Will the grid stay stable with just a lot of intermittent renewable energy as you get closer to 100% renewables? And so that's the one barrier that people are still clinging on to, that hopefully this kind of study and others, there are a lot of other studies that are similar, will overcome that barrier. But this shows for North America, US and Canada, for a 30-day period. This shows every hour that you're keeping the energy supplies matching the demand, plus changes in storage, plus losses, plus shedding of energy. This is Central America, Cuba, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Jamaica, South America, New Zealand, Australia, Southeast Asia, the Philippines, South Korea and Japan, Taiwan, China, Hong Kong, Mongolia, North Korea, Russia, Georgia, India, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Central Asia, the Middle East, Europe, Iceland, and Africa. So that's all 139 countries. We can keep the grid stable under 3 different scenarios. And this summarizes the cost of energy. If we look at the business as usual electricity sector today, and we just march that forward to 2050 and bring it back to today's dollars, it's 90.8 cents per kilowatt hour for direct energy for fossil fuel energy. But there's another 13 cents a kilowatt hour for the health cost and 16 cents a kilowatt hour for the climate cost. So the total cost of energy for a fossil fuel system, which is called the social cost of energy, is 38 cents a kilowatt hour. If we just look at replacing the fossil fuel electric power sector today with wind, water, solar, that's 9.7 cents a kilowatt hour social cost, because there's no health or climate cost. So it's about the same as the direct energy cost of the fossil fuel system, but the social cost is 1/4. But again, you're using 50% fewer kilowatt hours. So the actual cost to society is 1/8 of a wind, water, solar system compared to a fossil fuel system. Now, if we do all energy, which you can't compare with the fossil fuel system because it's hard to compare electric vehicles per kilowatt hour to gasoline because it's not kilowatt hour units. Anyway, so the total all energy though is 10.6 cents a kilowatt hour with a wind, water, solar system. Okay, so then let me just get to the final part, which is what do people think and what's happening on in terms of implementing these plans. So a couple of public opinion surveys. This is one that was done last year, 26,000 people in 13 countries. And they're interesting results. 82% of the people surveyed want a world with 100% renewable energy. I mean, this is not like more renewable energy. This is 100%, so this is everything. And this includes the United States. But only 66% believe climate change is a global challenge. So the interesting part about this is people don't have to believe in climate change to believe in clean renewable energy. And the other questions kind of indicate why, because 69% say renewables make countries more energy independent. 73% say renewables will boost economic growth. So, well, as long as people are interested in solving the problem, they don't have to actually believe in the problem. That's it's fine with me. This is another poll that was just in the US, but it was US states, 7 states. And nationwide, the question is, do you support or oppose powering all energy, so that's 100% of energy in the US entirely by clean and renewable sources like wind, solar, hydroelectric by 2050? That means homes, businesses, cars, trucks. 64% strongly supported that, 19% somewhat supported, so 83% strongly or somewhat supported that statement, which is similar result to the other poll, and only 16% opposed. And then you can see the state distribution where all the states had majorities, but some were stronger than others. Well, so does that translate into actual action? Well, there have been several bills and resolutions proposed in Congress that are still sitting there waiting to be voted on. There are actually 5. There's House Resolution 540, which calls for the United States to support a transition to 100% clean renewable energy. It has 60 co-sponsors. Senate Resolution 632, which supports 100% clean renewable energy. Senate Bill 987, it's a bill to transition from fossil fuels to 100% clean and renewable energy by 2050. And then there are 2 House bills, HR 3314 and 3671. One of them is toward 100% clean and renewable energy by 2050, and the other is to 100% clean energy, which they define as just wind and solar and water, and efficiency by 2035. So it's very aggressive. So these are just sitting there waiting to be voted on. So there is some action at the federal level, but no votes. But at the state level, a lot more has been done. Hawaii has a 100% law as of 2015. For all electric power, has to be clean renewable power by 2045. California's SB 100, as I mentioned, is effectively 100% renewable electricity by 2045 and 60% by 2030. The actual wording is 60% eligible renewables by 2030. And eligible renewables are defined as the renewables I've listed, but not including large-scale hydro it includes small hydro. And so then the other 40% is either eligible renewables or large hydro. That's why they actually had that additional 40% as separate, was to allow large hydro to be included, or technologies that have not been discovered yet that have zero carbon emissions. And then Vermont has a law to go 75% renewable by 2032. New York has 150% by 2030. Washington State has a proposal to go 100% carbon-free by 2045. I think it's going to be voted on pretty soon. And there are, well, as of this writing, there were 82 cities, at least 82 cities committed to 100% renewables throughout North America, well, throughout the United States, but there are also some in Canada as well. And including some large ones like Atlanta, Georgia, and Portland, Oregon, and Madison, Wisconsin. And some small ones like Boone, North Carolina, Abita Springs, Louisiana, Moab, Utah. So these are good steps, but you really need action at the local community levels to really make this happen. And then another thing that's going on is 144 companies, including pretty much all the major companies of the world, have committed to going to 100% renewables. Apple and Google claim to have already reached 100% in their annual average. Google announced they want to reach 100% every hour. So they're trying to actually do it hour by hour to match the load of their data centers. But this is all good progress. I mean, a lot of these companies are actually moving up their timelines. Just in the last week, I think Sony moved up their timeline by 10 years. So they're finding that it's actually pretty straightforward to do. And it saves them a lot of money in the process. There are over 70 nonprofits that are committed to 100% renewables, and they've really been pushing on the ground, going to, like the Sierra Club has really been working to get cities to commit. And the RE100.org has been helping a lot with companies. And the Solutions Project is a nonprofit that I helped co-found that has been really organizing all these other nonprofits and also trying to engage disadvantaged communities and trying to get them interested in the solutions as well. Well, to summarize, and I didn't talk about jobs, but we did find that we would create 24 million net long-term full-time jobs minus over those lost with the transition, including 2 million in the United States. And the land footprint and spacing I talked about, we'd avoid 4 to 7 million air pollution deaths per year, slow, then eventually reverse global warming. We think the grids can stay stable throughout the world with 100% renewables. The cost per kilowatt hour, the direct cost, the energy cost is slightly less than fossils, but the energy, health, and climate cost per kilowatt hour 1/4, and the absolute cost, not per kilowatt hour, the absolute cost is about 1/8 of fossil fuels in terms of the social cost. And then finally, transitioning to wind, water, solar, we think it's technically and economically possible. Main barriers are still social and political. The solutions, though, do require collective willpower, but immediate deployment. IPCC agrees that we really need an 80% transition within 10 to 12 years by 2030 at the latest, and 100% by 2050 to avoid a 1.5 degree global warming. If you want more information on this, the actual plans, the published plans there's one website there, and the grid studies are at another website. The talk similar to this is actually already posted online. If you want this particular talk, I'm happy to send it to you. And also the solutionsproject.org, you can go there and click on a map for a state, a country, and even a city and town, and you'll see a plan. And I'm also, I put updates on Twitter quite frequently. So thank you very much if you have any questions. Thank you.
So thank you very much. We have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions. We'd ask that you use the microphone. We've got 2 microphones here. If you're okay with some audience questions, start here.
I see that you didn't mention nuclear power. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so we've considered nuclear power, but, well, there are a lot of issues with it aside from the fact that there are risks associated with it. The IPCC identifies risks such as weapons proliferation, meltdown risk, mining risk, waste risk. But right now it's just too costly and it takes too long to plan to operate. So the average time between planning and operation of a nuclear plant, that's actual getting it permitted and sited and getting it funded and then the construction is 10 to 19 years. So an average of 14 years, like if we plan one today, it wouldn't even be ready till 2032 at the soonest. And in fact, there's only one plant being built in the United States in Georgia. And that plant, it started in 2008, and it's not going to be done until 2023 at the soonest. So that's 15 years, as you can see. And it just costs 4 to 5 times more per kilowatt hour now for a new construction plant compared to wind and solar, onshore wind and utility solar. Onshore wind and utility solar are now the cheapest forms of electricity in the United States by far. In terms of new ones, they're half the price of new natural gas. So they're about between 2 and 4 cents a kilowatt hour, and gas is like 6 cents a kilowatt hour. So, and nuclear is about 14, 15 cents a kilowatt hour. So it doesn't compete economically, it takes too long. So that's why, in fact, there was a South Carolina plant that was actually, they started it, they spent like 7, 8 years and billions of dollars, and then they just went bankrupt. And now the ratepayers of South Carolina, yeah, they're stuck with the bill for these failed nuclear plants for the next 30 years. So,
Thank you very much for your enlightenment there. I'm looking forward to the day that the last bit of coal is burned and we have no more to burn. But there's one industry that uses coal, and that's the steel industry. How do we deal with that from both the use of coal in making steel, and I believe that the major part of the energy for making steel is also coal? Is there an electric source that can be used that gets it hot enough?
Yeah, so with steel, first of all, steel and concrete are the two industries where there are carbon emissions that aren't associated with energy. But in both those industries, about half the carbon emissions are associated with the energy to actually produce the product. So you can actually eliminate both concrete and steel. You can eliminate half the emissions just by electrifying the high temperature processes. But in the case of steel, there actually recently there have been developments of alternate technology to produce steel without using coal. And I think it's pretty much like 99% carbon free. So I don't know how far along that is, but there is a technology now available for that. Concrete, there are others that are in the works. I think it's less far along. I think concrete, that's probably the one place if you can capture the carbon, at least in the short term, and because it's one stream of carbon that you can capture it locally and then use it for something else. That's one area of carbon capture. I'm not in favor of carbon capture for coal plants or gas plants because that doesn't avoid the actual use of coal or gas. In fact, because when you have a carbon capture at a coal plant, you still have the mining, the transporting, and the refining of the coal, or at least transport and mining, and that's like 1/3 of all the energy goes to that process. And plus you need 25% more coal because that's how much energy you need to run the carbon capture equipment. So carbon capture is not a solution. In fact, there was a Department of Energy study recently that showed that even natural gas with carbon capture, it still puts out 300 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour versus without it, it's like 700 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. So 300 compared to a wind turbine, even manufactured with today's background grid, is only 10 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. So natural gas with carbon capture is still 30 times more CO2 per kilowatt hour than a wind turbine. So it just makes no sense in terms of, it's not helping solve the problem at all.
I have a quick question for you about land use. You mentioned whatever that very small number was of land use that we would use to put in new renewable energy systems. So are you also thinking about using brown use land, like, old buildings and, spaces where there's old mining locations and such like that? Is that included in that, or would that be extra?
Well, we haven't specified those particular areas, but you could, sure. In fact, that's what China just did. They just there was an old coal mine that was turned into a lake, and then they put floating solar on top of it. Just went up this week, I think. It was huge. It was like the most humongous solar field I've seen in a long time. But yeah, you can. Those are ideal lands to use for this type of activity.
Hi, I'm a resident of San Jose, and I've been following some of the group that are meeting to talk about the Diridon station rebuild there with Google and other things, and I think there's a huge opportunity to build something that's very energy sustainable, water sustainable, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are. How would a resident of San Jose try to help make sure that this is a completely electrified development?
Sorry, I'm not familiar with this.
So Diridon Station in San Jose is a big transit hub that is going to be rebuilt completely. And I think there's a big opportunity. I'm trying to do my part as a citizen to call for electrification, but I'm just,
right.
Can I put you in touch with them?
Well, I mean, if Google's involved, they're pretty up to speed on what to do. But yeah, I can imagine any new development should, I mean, there is a law in California that all new residential buildings have to have solar on them, enough solar to produce their own energy. I don't know, I think there might be an equivalent commercial bill either being proposed but definitely every building should have at least solar, should be efficient, should be, have all the latest technologies, be electrified, no gas. I mean, it would be great if, especially in communities, if you pretty much outlawed gas in new homes. I think that would be.
It seems like there's an opportunity to say, no natural gas infrastructure, look how much we save.
Right.
And that would be something that other communities would see and do.
Oh yeah, I know Palo Alto has been considering this to have no gas in new homes, and I mean it saves money, but I think you have to have communication with the people, just because most people are not familiar with all the new technologies and what can be done. But anyway, that is an opportunity to create a really nice energy efficient building or set of buildings.
There's certain things that are required for batteries, like lithium is a raw material. For heat pumps, you're going to need some sort of refrigerant that can make the heat pump run efficiently. Is there enough of those materials? Like, we're not, as a world, using very much of that material right now. Is there enough of that material in order to actually do this transition? Like, does our planet have that?
Yeah. Well, we did do an analysis in 2011 just to look at that very question. At that time, there was, like, at that time, there was enough lithium resource for like 3 billion or 4 billion cars or vehicles, and there are 1.1 billion vehicles in the world today. And usually, when people start looking for more resources, they can find it. I mean, lithium's not it's a pretty common element. I'm sure even more of it could be found. But you also have, if you recycle it too, which a lot of these companies are recycling as well, car companies especially, then that can last a lot longer. I mean, things like platinum you would need for hydrogen, but you also have platinum for catalytic converters, which you'll no longer need. So that's a case where you're going to trade off. And neodymium is used for wind turbine generators for permanent magnets and wind turbine generators. There's like 7 times more available than you need for all the wind turbines in the world. So I don't think, and there are also things you can trade off in solar. There are certain materials that you'd have to trade off. You might have to trade off if there are shortages, but there are plenty of different types of solar cells. And even batteries, there's also, instead of lithium ion, you can now start to use zinc. So there are different options.
Do you see a significant role for biofuel, like liquid biofuel, especially for things like planes?
No.
It's not happening these days.
Well, there are some people that are using them, but not in our plans don't call for biofuels because we're trying to eliminate combustion and to eliminate air pollution. And biofuels cause just as much air pollution as gasoline or diesel. They can save carbon depending on how they're produced, but even that's debatable in some cases. So, and they use so much land. I mean, to grow, photosynthesis is only 1% efficient, whereas solar photovoltaics are 20% efficient. So on the same land, you can either grow a crop and produce 1/20th the amount of energy on the same land as if you put photovoltaics on that land. So yeah, it makes no sense from a land use point of view, from an air pollution point of view, and also it's costly as well. I mean, compared to what you can get, because an electric car, you can drive at 80 cents a gallon. Gasoline car, what's the cost of gasoline? It's $4 plus a gallon, and biofuels are similar to that. So that's the nice thing about electric cars, they'll save you $20,000 in fuel costs if you drive 15 years, 15,000 miles a year, which is the average in the US.
We have time for maybe 2 more questions before we have our next speaker.
I think I noticed in your summary slide that you mentioned reducing global warming and then even reversing it. Did I get that right? And if so, can you expand on that a bit?
Well, when I say reversing, you're first going to, because if you eliminate all the emissions today, especially carbon dioxide, the temperatures will still go up for a while because, well, they're not going to, if you eliminate everything today, they'll go down. But CO2 is going to stay in the atmosphere even after you've stopped emitting it. So what's out there is going to still cause warming for a while. So eventually, then the temperatures will cool down. They'll stay constant for a while, but then they'll eventually cool down.
I'm really curious how PG&E was able to tell you that you could only have 2 batteries. And more broadly related to that, how big an impediment are the existing utility companies to conversion to renewables?
Well, the reason, so they have this esoteric rule that they helped create that says you can't have larger than a 10 kilowatt inverter. Well, if you have larger than a 10 kilowatt inverter, then they have to be able to measure the solar actually in the inverter. Right now they do their measurements outside the house, basically, outside the meter. But in an inverter, if you have a battery and solar going to an inverter, they claim they have to be able to measure the solar specifically in the inverter to separate it from the battery, what's coming from the battery. And if it's less than 10 kilowatts, they don't care. But if it's more than 10 kilowatts, they use that as an excuse to say you have to be able to measure it. And because they don't have any way to measure it, you can't do it. That kind of answers my second question. Yeah, but I mean, there was a workaround, but it was even more complicated, and it would actually be less beneficial than shutting off 2 batteries. But yeah, utilities are starting to come around because they realize that they better join this momentum, otherwise they're going to lose out. Yeah.
I was surprised in Southern California, where Southern California Edison doesn't sell you gas, they're much more aggressive in promoting electrification. And I think the problem with PG&E is they don't care which you buy. Until we get that split up, we're not going to see the necessary drive from PG&E to get this to happen.
Oh yeah, although some people at PG&E have told me that they actually would wish their gas would go away because now they have to spend so much money just making sure it doesn't blow up.
Well, I think that might be a great point to pivot to our next speaker. I want to thank you, Professor Jacobsen.
Thank you.
Our next speaker will be a brief, and there'll also be time for more Q&A. So I know you probably still have lots more questions. So we'll do a little transition here. All right. Well, thank you, Professor Jacobsen. Our next speaker here is Dr. Aimee Gotway Bailey, which is the Director of Decarbonization and Grid Innovation at Silicon Valley Clean Energy. Aimee's work centers around identifying and managing technical, economic, and regulatory barriers and opportunities to achieve deep decarbonization. Prior to Silicon Valley Clean Energy, Aimee has held positions focused on solar technology, policy, climate policy, emerging technologies, and strategic planning at EDF Innovation Lab, PG&E, City of Palo Alto Utilities, Global Environmental Institute in Beijing, China, and the U.S. Department of Energy. Aimee has a Bachelor's of Engineering in Materials Science from the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia and a PhD in Physics from Imperial College in London. I'd like to welcome Aimee to the stage. There you go. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks very much for that intro. First, can you guys hear me okay? Awesome. So it's kind of a tough act to follow, but I agreed to do it anyway because I couldn't pass up the opportunity to share a bit more about what your community is doing to help decarbonize. So thank you, Misty, for inviting Silicon Valley Clean Energy to say a few words about our vision and plans for decarbonization. It's a treat to be here, for sure. I wanted to first start by giving a brief intro to the organization in case people aren't familiar with it, since we are reasonably new, and then go into kind of some of the activities. So this will be a fairly brief presentation. So what is Silicon Valley Clean Energy? We were established in 2016, and we're one of the many so-called community choice energy programs or community choice aggregators formed by local communities to source cleaner power at competitive rates and also offer new choices, economic and environmental benefits. So for context as well, there's some discussion about PG&E. So all of our customers, Silicon Valley Clean Energy customers, are still PG&E customers. So we cover the source, the generation component of the service. PG&E still does the transmission and distribution, and also the billing and other services to the customer. And so if you're not familiar with community choice energy, I know many of you are. Actually, many here were instrumental in founding SVCE. But for those who aren't familiar, CCAs were enabled by the legislature in the wake of the energy crisis, actually. And that was when the public was demanding a lot more transparency, fiscal responsibility, and in short, kind of accountability. And so they created an option for there to be retail choice, but in a way that kind of checked those boxes. And there are a lot of different reasons that communities decide to form a CCA. Some of them that I mentioned, and kind of the emphasis that the community has can be different, but largely it's local, transparent decision making. Most CCAs in California, at least, are formed also to meet climate goals because they know they can reduce greenhouse gas emissions by transitioning their electricity supply to renewable. There is also an additional choice when you have a CCA, so it's not just the monopoly incumbent. And then there's also rate competition, rate stability, and really the opportunity to develop and offer community-based programs. And so for SVCE, we're based here in Santa Clara County. Our customers include around 270,000 customers total. Most of those are residential customers, like around 90% if you look at accounts. But if you look at revenue, basically the amount of electricity we sell, the vast majority, 70%, is going to our commercial customers, a lot of the tech companies that are in our service territory. And so these are the member communities. We are made up of Santa Clara County, so that includes all of the unincorporated regions, and also all of the cities within the county except Palo Alto, Santa Clara, and San Jose. And so Palo Alto and Santa Clara both have municipal utilities, so they've already had community choice basically for a century. And then San Jose is going through their own process to develop a community choice energy program. And so our board of directors is made up of elected officials, one each from each of these different member jurisdictions. And I think SVCE, what it means to the community, you know, it is having options, but it's also enabled the community to take a really big and immediate step to reduce carbon emissions by taking control of the electricity supply. And as we'll discuss, that's kind of not the end. So SVCE's mission, our overarching mission, is to reduce dependence on fossil fuels. So that's everything we're doing as an organization is really central around this mission. And this is the mission directly from our community. It's why we exist. And although we're quite young, we've made some progress to date. So we launched in 2016, and so in order to measure progress, we took a baseline inventory of emissions within our service territory, following the adage that you can't manage what you don't measure. And so this is what the 2015 baseline emissions look like for SVC service territory. And these are specifically energy-related emissions. So anything related to kind of wastewater treatment and other factors are excluded here. This is electricity-related emissions, natural gas-related emissions, predominantly from heating in buildings, and then also transportation. Like those are the three big components. So this is our baseline, and SVC had originally established a target of reducing emissions 30% by 2021. And we're at the stage where are halfway towards achieving that goal. And so on the left-hand side, that's our baseline emissions inventory again. On the right-hand side, that's our 2017 emissions inventory. And so we'll be doing this on an annual basis to continually monitor and track progress. What you'll notice between the two, the right one is smaller, indicating the smaller, fewer total emissions. And the components specifically that have shrunk are the electricity-related components. Note there are still emissions from electricity because we have some customers that remain bundled customers with PG&E. We also have some large commercial customers that have direct access, so-called direct access, which means they have complete retail choice, and so they go out in the competitive market and can buy electricity from anyone. And then also in 2017, Milpitas, one of our larger cities, only started enrollment around mid-year. And so actually in 2018, this will be closer to 20% reduction. However, we have a lot further to go, as you can see. And so this is just a graphical kind of depiction of progress. So on the left-hand side is our 2015 inventory. On the right-hand side, the 2017 inventory. And this was using a Department of Energy funded tool to kind of tease out what were factors that actually caused increases in emissions. So increased therms per household is one. We've had employment growth, which is a great thing. That's also increases emissions, increased usage of vehicles. But we've had a lot of things that have actually resulted in decreasing emissions, the biggest one being from the electricity fuel mix. And so that's largely the progress to date is largely from our electricity supply. We call our retail rate products Green Start, which if you're enrolled in SVCE, that's the standard supply portfolio. It's GHG free. You also have the option to opt up to 100% renewable, which all of the municipal accounts in our service territory, I believe all of them have chosen to do. We've made a little bit more progress to date, including a demand response program for our large commercial customers called Peak Day Pricing. We have some community engagement grants to help communicate and engage parts of the community that are typically underserved. And then we also have secured a grant from the Bay Area Air Quality Management District for a program that will help incentivize switching from natural gas water heaters to heat pump water heaters. And so that's a program that's in the process of being designed and will be launched early next year, late this year or early next year. However, there's a lot more to go. What we're doing is we're in the process of really developing a comprehensive portfolio of programs and initiatives to really tackle decarbonization in the service territory. Our overarching strategy, you pretty much learned all about it in the last presentation. This isn't unique to SVCE. This is kind of the recipe to decarbonize. You decarbonize your electricity supply, then you switch everything over that you possibly can to be fueled by that carbon-free electricity. And in addition to electrifying everything, maintaining progress towards harnessing energy efficiency and also ensuring grid integration are kind of other aspects that kind of need to be in place in order to cost effectively achieve deep decarbonization. So this is our kind of guiding light. We also have been in the process of developing kind of a strategic framework to really identify how will SVCE determine which opportunities or which programs, which initiatives to undertake. And so this strategic framework was kind of the result of a lot of stakeholder engagement, a lot of different input. So the types of activities that we'll do relate to retail products and services. It includes rates, but it also includes helping clean energy technologies gain traction in the marketplace. Education and outreach, I mean, I think that was a big one from Professor Jacobsen's answer to one of the questions, like how do you do things at a local level? Well, you have to have that education, and we're a community-based organization. That's really going to be a core function we see for our organization, helping to build up education and awareness related to electrification. Public policy is a big one, not just at the state level, but we are made up of governments. Our board, they're elected officials in these governments, so there's an alignment there that, that really lends itself to helping to make progress with local policy, including potentially building codes that help support all electric. And market transformation. So there are many different types of market barriers that prohibit people from adopting heat pump water heaters. And so we can imagine taking an active role in helping to mitigate those market barriers. So the evaluation metrics are listed in the middle there in orange. We want to pursue initiatives that have customer and community value, that have an emissions impact. After all, that is our overarching mission. And we want to do things that are scalable and transferable. Ultimately, we know our service territory is responsible for a pretty small fraction of global emissions. So if SVCE and this community wants to have an impact beyond our service territory, we want to pursue programs, initiatives that really can be transferable outside of Silicon Valley. And that's really what this area is kind of all about, innovation, and innovating in a way that scales. And so we're excited to be able to try some new things that we think are going to have an impact elsewhere. Equity in service and things that are a core role for SVC are a couple other metrics as well. And how will we do it? We'll do it in a way that really embraces innovation. I think in a way that historically traditional utilities maybe haven't. We're in a data-driven society, and we're in an era where everything is digitized. And so certainly being guided by data and analytics is another key aspect of how we are going to approach all aspects of program development, and then with partners. So just a few more comments. So in tandem with developing kind of that overarching strategy and framework, we also are developing this comprehensive portfolio of programs. And this has been a multi-month stakeholder process. Actually, many of the members of the advisory groups I'll mention on the next slide are in this room as well. And so we're in the dark blue section of the right-hand part of this chart. And so we're going to be bringing to the board of directors in December, this decarbonization strategy and our programs portfolio for their review and hopefully, approval, revision and approval, what have you. And so you'll be seeing a lot of information, hopefully late this year, early next year, about different initiatives launching. So I'd encourage you to keep an eye out for mailings and other advertisements from SVCE. And so I know there are a lot of acronyms on here, and so just to highlight a couple of the acronyms, 2 of our key advisory groups include the Customer Programs Advisory Group, which Gary is on, and those are volunteer residents providing feedback on residential programs. And so they've been working for a number of months on feedback to different program areas and program design. And we also have a member agency working group, and actually Misty is a superstar member of that working group, and that's city staff coordinating and communicating their municipal priorities to SVCE. So, but there are, obviously a lot of other key stakeholders in addition to our member agencies and our customers that kind of need to be a part of this equation, that need to be a part of this transformation to achieve deep decarbonization. And so we don't have kind of standing advisory groups to provide to seek input from most of these organizations. We kind of do it in a workshop type format. But okay, so just I wanted to give you a brief highlight of kind of some of the prioritized program areas from our advisory groups. And this kind of goes back to the Venn diagram of how what is our overarching strategy. So for power supply, I mentioned our supply is GHG free, but there are a lot of opportunities still to improve. For instance, new retail rate products. And so we have, as a CCA, we actually have a lot of control over retail rates, at least specifically the generation component. And it turns out that retail rates can present some specific barriers, some pretty steep barriers to electrification. And so we're in the process of kind of evaluating how we want to tackle the opportunity that's presenting itself there, just having control of retail rate products. Maybe I'll highlight a couple more, maybe in the lower left-hand corner. The second bullet down. Program for innovative pilots. I think going back to some of the comments before about this unique location in which we live, a lot of the discussions that we've been having both internally as staff and with different stakeholders is like how do we engage this innovation ecosystem and really try to activate the private sector and direct them to address problems that we see that need to be addressed based on our position in the market. And so one way we can do that is to set up a framework to nimbly engage in different partnerships, pilot partnerships and other maybe research partnerships with different entities. It's not just the private sector, nonprofit sector as well, academic institutions, national labs. And so we're looking at kind of developing that structured program that would help enable those, that type of innovation. Okay, so I'll just, there's a lot here. I won't speak about every single bullet point, but it will be in the recording if you want to refer back, or if you have any questions about any particular one, happy to address particular questions. But I guess I'll just say, we're trying to, we know we need to address every part of this Venn diagram, and if it's not addressed elsewhere. And so for instance, all of our customers are already paying PG&E effectively for energy efficiency programs. So does it make sense for SVCE to also offer those programs? Probably not. So we want to help them access the programs that they've already paid for. So how can we be additive? So. Okay, so the next steps are really the board member, to bring the decarb strategy and programs roadmap to the board in December, and then to really execute, measure, monitor, and course correct. And so we anticipate, coming back on a fairly regular basis to our board and to our communities to update, provide updates on progress, and also really identify what are things that are working and what are things that aren't working, because they're going to be both. and then figure out how to adapt and go from there. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Aimee. That was great. We have time for about 5-10 minutes of questions. If anybody has questions for Aimee, I see one over here.
Without going into too deep of a wonk question, my understanding though is that just in the past week and a half there was a very negative ruling on the PCIA, the power charge indifference adjustment, and I've seen statements from CCAs that this is very damaging. I was wondering to what extent has that was by the California Public Utilities Commission, to what extent does that ruling damage your ability to function and to decarbonize, and is it worth going to the California legislature to get that PUC decision overruled?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and probably above my pay grade, but I'll do my best to answer, at least from my perspective as the director of decarb. You know, certainly how we're funding, how we're determining our budget for programs is a percentage of operating revenue. And what this decision does is reduce that operating revenue in effect. And so it will impact the amount of money that we have to reinvest in our community. How much it will impact it is still yet to be determined. And so although the methodology was approved, there is still, we still don't know exactly how it's going to impact our rates until the coming weeks when there are kind of rate adjustments announced by PG&E. And so I think, you know, what this really does though is help focus our concentration on leverage. And really being able to take what was already going to be limited funds, now it's probably going to be a bit smaller, and really leverage the finite money we have and the influence we have to try to kind of activate the community, the innovation ecosystem, and others around us to decarbonize. So we anticipate actually needing a lot more innovation, needing to rely a lot more on partners, and also needing to be a lot smarter about, you know, even smarter than we had planned about how we go about doing things. And so using really data to inform what is going to give us the most bang for the buck, and really be kind of smart about all of our investments. So I'll say that.
Yeah, one of the things that I've heard about, as Dr. Jacobsen mentioned, is the problem with grid reliability is with renewables is not enough storage. And if I understood Dr. Jacobsen, it sounds like that could be something that's not as expensive. Is that something that community choice programs would be looking at, investing in storage?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's definitely something that community choice energy programs are looking at, including SVCE. And so I think a lot of what I focused on was more kind of things happening within the community. But if you look actually at our power supply, so right now we're in the process of signing some longer term contracts. And so when you're a CCA and just starting up, you know, you don't have operating reserves, you're basically building out staff, and so a lot of the contracts you're signing for renewables are more shorter term. And until you can release like a request for proposals and get proposals in and evaluate them, like that's when you start making a lot of important commitments and really making an impact on having an additive impact on renewable energy development. So long story short, 2 of the 3 contracts we're looking at, one contract has already been signed, it's a wind contract. But we've gotten responses that incorporate solar. It's utility scale solar in that case, combined with renewable generation. So there's some activity that could be happening at the power supply side. On the demand side, so on the community level, we are certainly looking at storage. Going back to the statement I made about, you know, our customers are already paying for a lot of programs that are administered through PG&E. One of those programs is called Self-Generation Incentive Program, SGIP for short, and it actually provides pretty substantial rebates for storage. And so in that case, In the near term, we anticipate our role will be to ensure that our customers are familiar with that program and are aware of it and can evaluate whether that's a good option for them. But there may also be other opportunities for storage for sure.
Thank you, Aimee. Where exactly are we purchasing our energy from? Are these from private, renewable sources? Are they public, out of state?
So the long-term contract that was signed a couple months ago is a wind contract that is in New Mexico. And it would be delivered, I believe, in 2 or 3 years from now, because it's not built yet. It's still in the process of being built. I think most renewable developers, at least if we're talking about new renewable projects, to my knowledge, they're all for-profit, but there are certainly kind of government sources of renewable electricity. We have a lot of large hydro in the state, which are federal projects. For SVCE, right now, the focus is in part looking at our overarching load profile and looking at what resources could really match that. The wind project was a really good match for our load profile, and so it helps us make a better argument that we are GHG free, the more alignment there is. But we haven't, I don't believe, made any policy decisions, or board rather, haven't made any specific policy decisions regarding kind of what you're asking for, like whether there should be a carve out for specific technology or a carve out for local. Those sorts of policies are often kind of enveloped in what's called an integrated resource plan, to use a wonky utility term, but a community-driven process basically to kind of arrive at that sort of policy decision making, and that's planned for the coming year.
Maybe a follow-up. For those that have solar on the rooftops, and we sign up with the system, how does that go into your system, PG&E system? Is there a tie-in there?
So for the vast majority of solar that's interconnected in SVCE service territory, so it's all, if it's a very large commercial customer with solar, like maybe they have a data center, I mean, it's very possible they're using all of the solar electricity on site. But however, for a home, especially if it's a smaller home, and they size the system to meet all of their annual electricity needs, then that electricity is exported to the grid. And so basically, well, you saw Professor Jacobsen's load profile, those peaks where there was a lot of solar after the battery had already been charged. All of that additional peak that's exported to the grid and is basically helping meet the energy needs of his neighbors. And then there are certain rate structures that kind of help ensure he gets compensated, and so that's hence the $500 plus check from SVCE at the end of the day. Sorry, did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
We've got time for maybe about 3 more questions. I want to be respectful of all of your time, and then hopefully maybe Aimee can stay a little after for any other questions.
Hi, can you elaborate on the situation with the non-residential customers as to how competitive we are or aren't?
You mean in relation to like direct access and that bill?
Yeah.
I assume.
Well, that bill if you want, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so how competitive are we with our commercial customers? So SVCE's supply portfolio, our rates are cheaper than PG&E's. I believe it's 6%. And also we're cleaner. And so our default portfolio is GHG free. So for those customers that don't have full retail choice, the so-called direct access customers, then they're saving money with us. And I'm sorry I don't have the figures handy for kind of how much money has been saved by our customers since launch, but that's kind of the short answer. For those that are on direct access, like really large customers, like Stanford, for instance, how they procured that solar energy offsite, that was through a direct access construct. I mean, they have the option. Stanford's not doing that, but other entities in that situation, they could just choose the very cheapest option possible. And it's probably going to be cheaper than ours because it's probably going to be like 66% natural gas. And so if those direct access customers that maybe don't have an environmental kind of ethos, or that aren't like the Apples and the Googles, and maybe are in an extremely cost competitive industry, you could probably expect them to pursue a compliance project, a compliance product. And so that's actually one of the main reasons why a lot of the environmental organizations and also community choice aggregation community did oppose expanding direct access, because it would set us back in achieving our GHG goals.
I had a question or a comment. I think I've been disappointed at the communication that's come from SV, your organization. Seems to be very simplified and doesn't provide a level of detail which you need to make good decisions. PG&E also, of course, we all get our monthly bill, and they seem to have taken the tack of making it virtually impossible to figure out what the hell is going on, with numerous pluses and minuses and who knows what. So I would encourage you to, if you're going to make an impact in the community, you've got to get a better communication line, whether you have any control over what PG&E is doing as your client to deliver electricity. They could do a much better job of indicating what's going on. The other thing that appears to me is you don't actually pay more for electricity at different times of day or night. It seems like you do a contract that's just one price, but PG&E can charge ridiculous amounts to deliver it at times of day when you actually happen to want to use it. Well, so it seems that whole construct, on the one hand we read in the paper that we've got all this solar during the day that we really don't know what to do with, but on the other hand, we're encouraging people to use all their power later and to not use anything during the day. It makes no sense. We need a better understanding of the matching of supply and demand, I think, and explain that to the residents who are trying to make good decisions. Mm. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that feedback. Did you want me to address any particular part of it, or? I mean, I think it's very important feedback to have. I will make one kind of correction. So SVCE and any load serving entity, the cost of the electricity supply is dependent upon the time of day. So even though we're signing these long-term contracts with kind of fixed prices, PG&E does that as well. Other load serving entities do that as well. It's still a part of a calculation that involves, it's basically hedging. It's still a part of a calculation that involves time-dependent electricity costs and also marginal emissions.
Right, but the choices that a resident has in terms of on a cruise plan versus regular plan, it's just all the same as PG&E plan. It's not anyone driven by your organization, which is what I thought was going to change.
Well, it will change. So there are actually, and part of it's just because we're young as an organization. And most of the past year and a half has been building up staff, developing kind of a supply portfolio, releasing an RFP to enter into these long-term contracts. And so you have to kind of walk before you run, and so that's what we've been focused on first. But certainly, like I highlighted in a few slides above, retail rates it's an opportunity for massive improvement and also leverage. To help really catalyze decarbonization, and we recognize that, but there are actually a number of implementation barriers. And so we have a working group of a number of CCAs kind of working through those implementation barriers that would allow us to actually have rates that are different from PG&E, because right now we can't. Even though we have the authority to do it, based on board authority, operationally, we aren't getting the data that we need to be able to bill on different rates. So I appreciate that feedback. Stay tuned.
Okay.
Here. Hello.
Oh, sorry.
My name is Rod Sinks. I helped found this agency, and I'm Cupertino's representative of the board. I'm the first chair. So I'll give you some perspective from my time, since you're new. First of all, we deliberately sought contracts that would complement solar in the state of California. We have built a lot of solar, including locally, that is providing that energy during the daytime, but because of the duck curve, the resources that we are now investing in have to complement what we can get. So to do this responsibly, we've taken the lead. The wind from New Mexico is actually considered bucket one in California because we're also, through our contract, funding the transmission of that power into California. The efficiency factor, the factor that determines the amount of power we're getting, is much higher for that wind resource. We had looked at initially at Alameda County, but those contracts didn't make sense. So in any case, we're getting a lot more power by going to New Mexico and getting up into the hills. And why is that important? It's because the time at which that power ramps up is exactly when our solar is beginning to tail off. So we need to be thinking about our carbon footprint and generation sources across the Western grid. It's really important that we not be too parochial about where exactly we buy the power. The two solar contracts that you've talked about, both of those are bundled with storage. So we insisted that we not simply build more solar and contribute to the duck curve problem, but that we actually bundle those with storage. So those are coming to the board next week, I think. At least one of them? Maybe both of them?
I think
yeah.
both, yeah.
So we want to move the needle, but we want to do it in a responsible way. And what you'll see in 2019 from the CPUC and rate setting and other things is a press to change how time of day is applied for existing solar customers, everybody, right? You're going to start to see the value of the solar power that you put back on the grid go down during the daytime, and instead it's going to come up at night. So it's if we had that data, and we have been pressing to get it, we could also be running programs that better tailor the overall demand to the need. But I'll stay after if people have questions. And I want you to know, as one of the directors, we're about transparency. We want you to have a say in what we do. We meet here actually once a month, the board of directors, 13 of us. We want to make the programs that we have responsive to things you think are important. And yeah, we started in our first year, we were 1% under PG&E across the board. Since April, we've been 6% under. I can't predict the future, but our overall mission is to deliver the most efficient product we can that's also carbon free. So that's where we're coming from. And if you looked up what the NRDC had to say, National Resources Defense Council had to say about direct access, you would find them saying it's about the dumbest thing ever. If we want to go backwards and backslide, right, let's just go back to the world of Enrons, where people are, unsophisticated customers are approached by sophisticated companies making a fast buck. And that's what it is in many parts of the country. We have, we think, a better offering for our residents and businesses by being able to have sophisticated purchasing on behalf of not only getting a good price, but also getting a responsible product for our environment. Thanks.
So with that, I think we're going to have to wrap up here. I want to thank Aimee Bailey for her presentation. hopefully you'll be able to be here afterwards to answer some more questions. And we do have Rod Sinks here that can also answer questions. I want to thank all of you for attending today. I know it's been a great evening, and hopefully it gave you some hope for the future, and you learned a lot more about what's happening globally and locally. This presentation is being recorded, so it will be available on the city's website through the Cupertino Green webpage, which is www.cupertino.org/sustainability. Give us a few days to get that posted, but we'll also make sure we update the Facebook page and other places to get that out there. So thank you very much, and hope you have a good evening.